this week, I picked up the original The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde from my library, and I wanted to talk about it this Halloween weekend. Now, this book is often categorized as a mystery, but it's a little more on the edge between mystery and being just a horror-themed book. Unlike true mystery stories, at least in my opinion, wherein every detail that the characters come across is possibly a clue, that's not the case in this book. This book, which is almost more a short story, it reads like a short story, and in length, it's only 54 pages long, devotes a lot to the building of the atmosphere of the world. There aren't a whole lot of actual clues in the world and in the story. It's a lot of pure description. It's not so much as to be boring, or it's not too much description just for the sake of description, but it's mostly just atmosphere building. And almost everything you need to know about what actually takes place, or about what has taken place, is only in the last chapter. The first chapter is just a description of a brief encounter with Mr. Hyde, where he's done something cruel and seemingly completely sporadic. There's also a detailed description of Mr. Hyde's house, which is a curious, run-down, gloomy, falling apart, but doesn't really read as what you'd describe as a creepy, haunted house. It's the atmosphere of the city, on the other hand, is quite creepy. It's always very dark, very gloomy, very gray. And the setting is where you can be attacked from out of nowhere at any time. You feel this as you're reading it very effectively. And of course, this is exactly what Mr. Hyde does, attacks people out of nowhere. That motivates several of the characters to investigate and inquire about him. This story was first published in 1886, which is only 2 years before the Whitechapel murders, which were executed by whoever was Jack the Ripper. So any depiction of the dark, gloomy, dangerous streets associated with the Ripper murders very much fits the tone of Jekyll and Hyde. It's how the environment would look. It's the same setting, and in fact, you can easily imagine a fictional universe tying the Ripper murders to Mr. Hyde. Now, the second chapter is called The Search for Mr. Hyde, and it begins with the character of Mr. Utterson, who's the protagonist for much of the story, finding the will of Dr. Jekyll that leaves, in the case of either his death or his disappearance, over the span of 3 months or more. That time has to pass. Everything of his to Mr. Edward Hyde. Utterson finds Hyde and describes his face as the image of the devil itself. He resolves to find Dr. Jekyll to ask him, and more likely warn him about the will. In the beginning of the novel, Dr. Jekyll is will and control of Hyde. Jekyll is described as a large man, which I think that means tall. Today, when an author describes a person as large, it usually means width. But I don't think Jekyll has ever been portrayed as fat, so it means tall, I think. He is said to appear kind and smooth-faced. He's an upper-class, more chemist than physician. His house was originally owned by physicians, but when Jekyll bought it, or when his family bought it, I don't remember which, he took to chemistry. He's said to be a very polite person, but very introverted, focused on his work and research. Now, we don't actually get to see Jekyll's process of experiments. They're only hinted at with references and very brief appearances of his laboratory and his log. We see Hyde for brief moments, though most of his story is viewed from the investigations into him. Oh, on page 30, there's the first reference, it happens a couple of times, to Dr. Jekyll as Mr. J, which I thought was hilarious because that's also a name the Joker has used for himself. And given the context of the story, it's kind of fitting for Jekyll. It's not until the last chapter that we hear Jekyll describe his transformation, and the thought process he went into creating the potion. The way he describes the separation of good and evil within himself, he releases the evil portion of his soul, which he says he experiences as a younger, more free, more himself, but also smaller in stature. Some illustrations will show Hyde as significantly smaller than Jekyll. I don't imagine him as that much smaller, but a smaller person and more decayed looking. Now this is interestingly similar to the appearance of Darksiders in the Star Wars mythos. Jekyll's own turning to the dark side, the releasing of Mr. Hyde, is like a release of self, and indulging in the selfishness and the lust that in order to survive and take part in society, a human must usually repress. When you finally hear Dr. Jekyll speak, and he talks about what he went through, it reads as an exchange of the intellectual, cooperative part of a human self for the complete devotion to almost an orgy of venting anger, lust, hunger, frustration, sadism, and even fear. The catch is that this only works in the very short term, in very short bursts, otherwise it'll destroy you. Anyone tries to do this, they can only do this for a very short amount of time. Either because it very quickly gets you hunted down and killed or injured, or you reach a point where you just can't stop. And this ultimately is exactly what happens. The story really doesn't go through a lot of analyzing of this, it just shows it. Jekyll talks about it at the end, but at the end, after that last conversation, there is no Jekyll anymore. There is only Hyde. The last chapter, as I said early on, pretty much tells you everything you need to know about what happened to Jekyll, and it well explains why he left everything in his name to Hyde. It's worth it to read the entire book, though not just this last chapter. It's not very long, and it's a very spooky, fitting Halloween setting. I just think it's more of a short story with some very interesting views of human nature than an actual mystery.